This is Princeton Battlefield. On this location, George Washington and his men would rally in one of the most important battles in the Revolutionary War. Hey, welcome back to another episode of Destination Anywhere. Today we're going to wrap up our discussion about the 10 crucial days in American history by visiting the historic Princeton Battlefield in Princeton, New Jersey. In our last episode, we covered George Washington leading his Continental Army over the icy Delaware River in dramatic fashion, only to launch a surprise attack on Trenton. Well, after making quick work in the First Battle of Trenton, he retreated to Pennsylvania for a couple days, only to return for another attack on Trenton on January 2nd, 1777. But this time, after being cornered by British General Charles Cornwallis, Washington was once again forced to go into his bag of tricks. In the middle of the night, Washington and his men snuck out through a frozen back road and headed for an attack on Princeton. All the while, the British believed Washington's men were resting up for the morning. But during this early morning trek to Princeton, Washington's crew had run into some British soldiers, and right on the site of the Clark family farm, the Battle of Princeton would commence. Let's take a trip out and check out that battlefield. After leading his men through the darkness on the early morning hours of January 3rd, it was on this site, the site of the Thomas Clark farm, in which Washington's men would once again clash with British troops. At some point during the prior 24 hours, Cornwallis had sent word for British Lieutenant Colonel Charles Malhood to bring his men south from Princeton to help out for the morning battle at Assunpink Creek. It was during this trek that the British troops spotted Washington's men headed towards Princeton. Malhood decided to change course and head back to Princeton to cut off Washington's army. Washington then ordered General Hugh Mercer to head off Malhood's regiment to delay an attack on the main Continental group. It was at this point that Malhood's men would overrun Mercer's unit, and Mercer himself would receive a series of bayonet wounds that would critically wound him. In perilous condition, Mercer would be taken into the home of Thomas Clark, where he would be cared for by Dr. Benjamin Rush until passing away 9 days later. Built around 1772, the Clark family house served as a hospital to soldiers from both sides during and after the battle, and the estate remains an indelible image synonymous with the battlefield. Not far from the Clark farm, down a wooded trail, is another relic left virtually unchanged. The Stony Brook Friends Meeting House, situated adjacent to the cemetery, also served as a hospital during the battle. First constructed in 1724, this represents the oldest place of worship in Princeton. After Mercer was wounded and his unit began to retreat, it was about this time that Continental General John Cadwalder and his regiment of 1,000 militiamen arrived to provide some resistance against the pursuing British. With little battle experience, Cadwalder's men were quickly turned away. During this retreat, Washington and his army arrived at the battlefield to regroup Cadwalder's fledgling militia and the remains of Mercer's unit. Above horseback, Washington rallied the remaining soldiers and ordered an organized attack on the British forces. As the full-scale attack by both sides commenced, the battlefield was shrouded in smoke. Legend has it that when the smoke cleared, Washington remained above his horse and ordered his army to advance. Washington's army was too much for the British soldiers as they eventually fled the battlefield, many of which headed back to fortify Princeton. Before we head into town for the conclusion of the battle, let's check out a little more history on this site. First up, we have the Mercer Oath that stands here in honor of fallen General Hugh Mercer. Legend says that after Mercer was wounded on the battlefield, he laid upon an oak tree, unwilling to abandon his troops. The original Mercer Oak stood for about 300 years before being taken down by a storm in 2000. Eventually, a sapling grown from an acorn descendant of the Mercer Oak was planted inside the stump, and this tree stands today. Overlooking the battlefield across Mercer Road is this concrete structure known as the Ionic Colony. Designed by famed architect Thomas Walter, who also designed the U.S. Capitol, the colonnade was originally the entrance to a home in Philadelphia, before becoming the entrance to the homes at Mercer Manor around the start of the 20th century. It was eventually moved to its present location in 1957 and declared a national monument in 1962. Behind this massive structure is the final resting place for 36 British and American soldiers buried in the nearby area. This marker, dedicated in 1916, features an inscription courtesy of visiting Princeton University professor Alfred Noyes. Now, back to the war. After the British front lines fell apart, they scrambled for town. In pursuit, Washington's men eventually entered Princeton and launched an attack on the remaining British forces holed up in Nassau Hall. Eventually, these British remnants surrendered after an onslaught on the building, and nearly 200 British soldiers were captured. With Cornwallis and his men in pursuit, Washington quickly pulled his men out of Princeton and headed for Somerset, and eventually Morristown a few days later to set up winter quarters. The British, on the other hand, would head for New Brunswick to settle in. While that would be the end of the conflict in Princeton, the battle is immortalized by this statue dedicated in 1922. Located at the western tip of Nassau Street, the monument is dedicated to all New Jerseyans who lost their lives during the American Revolution, including those who lost their lives at the Battle of Princeton. Over the years, historians have debated the significance of the victory at Princeton for the Continental Army. While the number of men killed or captured wasn't overwhelming, it still showed that Washington's soldiers could stand up to the British Army in a full-scale battle. It also let the world know this would be a long, hard-fought war. Barely surviving just days before, the Continental Army was able to take Trenton, hold off General Cornwallis, and then chase the British out of Princeton, all in 10 crucial days. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to the Mickey Shuffle.